Wer rettet die Welt? Der Ö1 Festival Podcast zur Klima Biennale Wien.
Welcome to another edition of Wer rettet die Welt, the Ö1 podcast on the Vienna Klima Biennale. The festival brings together projects and events from the fields of art, architecture, design and science, all of which focus on a sustainable and livable future. In the last two podcasts, we presented the exhibitions at Nordwestbahnhof and the Vienna Kunsthaus. This time we move a little further into Vienna's city centre. Terminal Beach is the name of an immersive spatial installation by the London-based collective Troika, which is currently on display at the MAC Museum of Applied Arts.
So Terminal Beach, the title of the installation and exhibition, originates in a collection of short stories from one of our favorite writers, J.G. Ballard, who is known for his dystopian novels about the psychological effects or consequences of fundamental change in relation to technological development, but also environmental change.
Says Connie Fryer. Together with Eva Rucki and Sebastian Knoll, she makes up the group Troika. Founded in 2003, this group deals with the topics of technology, politics and natural philosophy. As with J.G. Ballard's text, the exhibition, Terminal Beach, also focuses on the effects of ecological change.
These topics that he's been discussing in his novels are very prevalent in the artworks we create and our interests in why we make these artworks. Terminal Beach refers to one of his short stories, and for us it's relevant because the installation itself discusses ideas of liminality and thresholds. Where are we now? What happens in the future? And what happens when we get there? So also in the context of the Climate Biennale.
The liminality mentioned by Connie Fryer describes the turning point in which the world currently finds itself. The term was defined by ethnologist Arnold von Gennep and further developed by Victor Turner in the 1960s. According to him, liminality is a phase of ambiguity in the transition from one socio-cultural state to another, a transitional state of betwixt and between.
We're in a time of change, in a time of rapid change, that we need to adapt to psychologically. Where are we now and what will we do when we get to the future? And these ideas of time are picked up in the film that we're showing in this installation.
A dystopian scenario on the edge of time. A nuclear catastrophe has wiped out almost all life on Earth. In the MAC Contemporary Exhibition Space, this depressing scenario is shown on a huge LED wall. A single tree still towers into the sky on this deserted planet. Next to it, a hairy robotic arm can be seen incessantly hitting the tree with an axe in the same rhythm.
The main protagonist is like a robotic arm that is normally used in production environment to make cars, and this is like the orange KUKA robot that everybody is familiar with.
Says Sebastian Knoll of Troika.
But if you look at how those technologies are depicted into the general public, it's something that is always very gentle, controlled. It's like the idea of progress in a kind of modernistic understanding of it, right? Whereas in actual fact, those robots are like immediately powerful, and there is some certain bestiality attached to it. They also, for us, metaphorically responsible for the ecological catastrophe that you see unfolded around. So what we wanted to show is portray the robot in a much more primal manner, and source back, if you want, the humanoid origin of it. So we fitted the robot with an axe and make it all furry, and he's cutting the last tree on Earth.
Troika used a 3D printer to model the robot arm and the axe. 3 different perspectives also reinforce the feeling of unease that arises when watching the video.
It's very relevant that we wanted to teach the robot, and we taught the robot to be brutal. And I think it mirrors quite accurately what we're doing with technologies. Those technologies are fairly neutral, and we choose to feed terrible data set to artificial intelligence, and therefore they spit out like terrible result and like become racist and become, like having like very, very right-wing result like all of a sudden. But that's because we are choosing what we teach them. And there is no concept of duty of care, which we found like remarkable, because just imagine the beauty of like being maybe on the cusp of like creating artificial life. That would be like an incredible human adventure, right? And yet you would treat that nascent AI or that nascent consciousness with absolutely zero regard, like feeding them garbage. You would not do that with a child, right? It's a fascinating idea.
Terminal Beach explores the boundaries of the artificial and the natural, a threatening otherness that clarifies questions around the topic of AI, a work that also leaves room for interpretation. In The Loop, the robot arm does not come to an end in a repeated chopping at the tree. Is there perhaps a hint here of the human-programmed machine becoming aware of its involvement? Will the robot arm drop the axe after all? Interpretations that Troika would like to leave open.
One of the things that we're very interested in is understanding intelligence. Where else could intelligence and awareness and consciousness lie? And what do we do with that information? But it's really about very much asking questions and opening up a very, very narrow way of seeing the world. If we manage that, if we attribute a more nuanced way of seeing things, hopefully we can then act accordingly in a much more nuanced way to the challenges that we're facing.
The various perspectives that open up to viewers of Terminal Beach are expanded in the spatial concept of the exhibition. A large pool of water lies at the foot of the video wall. The colours of the film also spill over into the room. Sound recordings from the British Arctic Survey can be heard from the loudspeakers. Electromagnetic waves recorded by the Polar Research Programme in the Arctic ice shelf. Sounds from the outer orbit that resemble the chirping of birds. Some of the 3D printed figures on display in Terminal Beach are also reminiscent of flying mythical creatures. The white sculptures, which look like sphinxes or phoenixes and relate to the museum space, are called border crossers. Exhibition curator Marlies Wirth.
Some of the sculptures are fleeing this desolated landscape, and some of the sculptures are also escaping the actual exhibition space. And they have a moment there in our MAC columned main hall, which has frescoes that are neoclassical and has a lot of like fable animals. It's like grotesque painting is the name of it. So even the MAC logo has a griffin, and which is a mythological being. So this is a nice moment where even the architecture of the museum does connect back to this idea of liminal beings.
Terminal Beach can be seen at the MAC on Vienna Stubenring until August the 11th. What does Troika hope to gain from the encounter with their first Austrian solo exhibition?
The bold title of this podcast is quite daunting, because I personally could not say that we're here to save the world, but what we hope to do is instigate conversations and thinking and talking and educating also our children. And that's, I think, what we'd like to do, that people walk away asking questions. There's lots to discover. Even after we installed the Terminal Beach, there were things for us to discover that we didn't anticipate. So there will be things that people are going to discover that weren't planned, and that's the most important thing.
Other discoveries within the MAC include the exhibition Protest Architecture, which can be seen in the upper exhibition hall until the end of August. Among other things, it shows a film about the Lobau bleibt protests by the artist Oliver Ressler. With Dog Days Bite Back, the Belvedere 21, a few streets away, is showing a comprehensive exhibition of works by the Styrian-born artist who, in cooperation with the Vienna Climate Biennale, is presenting works that deal with the role of art for the environment and the ecological spirit of resistance, among other things.
The exhibition is entitled Dog Days Bite Back, and this title actually goes back to a photo montage that Oliver Ressler made recently. It comes from a whole series of works that interweave photo montage and text works, so to speak.
Says exhibition curator Luisa Ziaya.
What we see in this photo montage is a snarling dog, a rather frightening creature in front of a burning background. In other words, a thoroughly dramatic image that, in its drastic nature, in combination with the title Dog Days Bite Back, alludes to the fact that climate collapse has arrived in our present day. This is not something that's projected into the future, but actually describes our present. And here, Oliver Ressler refers to a quote from Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary-General, who stated that last summer, 2023, was the hottest in history.
Hundstage des Sommers bellen nicht nur, sie beißen auch.
The so-called dog days of summer are not just barking, they are biting.
And this title refers to the fact that ultimately climate collapse will be felt by us all, that it is our reality, that it will change our everyday lives, that it will determine our everyday lives in the future.
Dog Days Bite Back is not an exhibition that is purely pessimistic or even resigned in the face of devastating climate change. On display are forms of resistance to prevailing systems that have always interested Oliver Ressler and which the artist offers a stage for in his exhibition. Time and again in the exhibition, for example, one encounters human-sized dolls in disguise. The artist calls this group of works New Model Army.
There are several figures spread throughout the exhibition. They are representatives of activists and are dressed in a certain way. They illustrate how climate justice movements operate very creatively with their appearance. For instance, dressing up as polar bears, but at the same time they're not just polar bears, but also protesters. In other words, they also convey a slogan. And these are the elements that Oliver Ressler interweaves in this so-called New Model Army. The figure, the sculpture, the object, the protagonist who also becomes present in this museum space.
Even though Oliver Ressler shows solidarity with certain forms of climate activism, curator Luisa Ziaya emphasizes that activism within museum spaces should also be viewed critically.
These are actions that are highly controversial, where public attention is ultimately used to target iconic works of art that are spattered with tomato soup, for example. I think that's a pretty ambivalent field. So, of course, our job as a museum is also to protect the works of art. I don't think it's the best way to draw attention to this really central issue of our time. And I also think that Oliver Ressler is quite critical of some forms of activism.
As a partisan observer, Oliver Ressler nevertheless wants to give a voice in his exhibition to those people who take to the streets every day and stand up for a future worth living. In an interview with Eins colleague Anna Soucek, he says, I believe, even if it is, of course, a very big problem, that for 30, 40 or 50 years, the political representations have not taken the necessary decarbonisation steps. I don't want to even talk about climate justice here. And that is also the cause of these advances. This has led to the climate collapse that we are already experiencing. We must not give up because of this. We must continue to fight. Because if we were to give up and think that it's all too late now anyway, hundreds of millions of people on the planet would lose their livelihoods. It would also mean certain death for various species that are already facing extinction. That's why these are also works that are related to activism, related to actions of civil disobedience, because I believe that the socially necessary change will come less from political representation than from disobedient bodies on the street. Another work in the exhibition, Dog Days Bite Back, also deals with the topic of climate activism. Not Sinking Swarming sheds light on the process of civil disobedience. The video shows activists planning a blockade in Madrid in 2019. To protect the participants, their faces were pixelated.
Und was üblicherweise sichtbar ist, sind natürlich.
And what is usually visible, of course, are media images that are taken of a blockade. The individuals are visible, also identifiable. They are also recorded by the police, by the media, and so on. In other words, there is a form of public visibility of these actors. What is usually not visible, however, is the underlying process of how the various activist groups of the climate justice movements in Spain come together here in the sense of a negotiation process and to plan this blockade.
Diese Blockade zu planen.
Oliver Ressler is present with his camera during these negotiation processes. It is not a journalistic or documentary position that he adopts in his work, says Luisa Ziaya. Instead, the artist expresses his connection with the activists. So, my films are about documenting a struggle to maintain the foundations of life on the planet. And I don't think there's any neutrality in this fight to maintain the planet's livelihoods, because it must be in the essential interest of all people on the planet that these and future generations also maintain the livelihoods that are necessary for life. Dog Days Bite Back is a cross-section of works from recent years. One of the more recent works is the 2-channel video installation Climate Feedback Loops from 2023, which shows film footage that Oliver Ressler shot in Svalbard.
Das liegt zwischen der norwegischen
This is between the Norwegian North Coast and the North Pole, a group of islands. Oliver Ressler was able to take part in a research expedition there and record the situation in the Arctic, the consequences of the climate crisis and climate collapse, which are becoming particularly severe and manifest there, capturing it in sound and vision.
In Bild und Ton, wenn man so will.
A scientist told me how 30 years ago in summer he would walk between the islands of Svalbard, from island to island, on summer sea ice. Summer sea ice, almost all gone now.
You can hear alienated sounds that capture the atmosphere of the region and lend the video recordings a sense of urgency. You can see the consequences of global warming in the Arctic.
The fact is that the effects of global warming are actually multiplied in the Arctic. This is also known as Arctic amplification. The Arctic amplification affects changes that then have massive and actually irreversible consequences. If the global average is said to be around 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, in the Arctic it is up to 7 or 8 degrees. And the consequence of this is that the Arctic, which was actually covered with snow and ice floes all year round, is warming up rapidly and the ice is melting. The problem that arises from the warming is that the solar radiation, 80 to 90% of which used to be reflected back before this warming took place, is no longer reflected back, and this solar energy hits the dark matter like stone and sets processes in motion there that are actually no longer reversible.
With his exhibition Dog Days Bite Back, Oliver Ressler makes it clear that art can play an important role in the fight for a better climate. In view of the noticeable climate collapse, it's too late for hopelessness anyway. The exhibition Soil Fictions deals with the significance of the soil and its inhabitants, a solo exhibition by Styrian sculptor Angelika Lodera, which can also be seen at Belvedere 21. The various works of art are laid out on the floor in a large room. There are no barriers. Visitors pave their own way and are subtly encouraged to keep the necessary distance, a distance that people have all too often neglected in the past. Curator Verena Gamper.
That's a bit of a common thread or the heart of this project. The question of what space humans take up on the Earth, or the fact that we as humans do not use the Earth alone. So there are many living beings that use the soil not only as a living space or as a space from which we extract natural resources. And this shared togetherness is also something that is seen in this exhibition.
On display are works in which Styrian artist Angelika Lodera shares authorship with the ground, a collaboration with the creatures of the earth.
There are these abandoned mole tunnels that are used. There are abandoned woodpecker holes that are used. There are abandoned earth cricket holes that she uses as molds. The material decision is, of course, still up to Angelika Loderer, and that is also one that is remarkably diverse here in this work.
Angelika Loderer, who studied sculpture under Erwin Wurm at the University of Applied Arts, is known to the public primarily for her work with metal, bronze, aluminium, and other sculptures.
And the variety of materials is really striking here. We have metalworks, of course, but there are also works made of plaster or mushroom mycelium. But there are also bones or clay wasp cocoons. There are waxworks, and there's also a sandwork.
One group that stands out somewhat is the group of works entitled Roadkill. Various vertebrates can be seen on small plinths.
You see a snake, or you recognize a hedgehog, a sparrow, and a blackbird. So they're animals that have been run over. They've fallen victim to road traffic, and that Angelika Loderer then picked up and preserved in a kind of translation process in metal casts. They're almost like a memorial because they're the only ones here on this pedestal and are, of course, also traces of human activity. People are actually hardly present in this exhibition. You see bodies, imprints, fragments, abandoned body shells, if you like, or traces of human activity, such as these creatures that have been run over. And these creatures that have been run over naturally also speak about how much space humans take up. The issue of soil sealing, the issue of habitats that are being destroyed by crossing roads. This lack of consideration that humans actually show towards their fellow inhabitants on Earth.
In addition to the admonishing sculptures from the Roadkill series, it is the casts of feet and hands that immediately catch the eye when entering the room. These bronze sculptures are called Investigate.
And Investigate already has a bit of this movement in the title. So this exploration, this roaming around, looking to see what's there. And you see fragments of legs and hands that are actually frozen movements or have been preserved. But they're not limited to the body. They have strange peaks on which they stand. And they're created by the artist, showing these body fragments or these extremities as they grow. And the wax, in its dripping quality, then solidifies into such spikes that extend downwards and include this complete impression in wax. This drop is then translated into bronze. I found it exciting that here in this exhibition, which is about the ground, when you have the impression that these bodies, these human bodies, are drawing liquid from the ground, that you're plodding through the mud, looking for this connection, but no longer have it. I think that's quite a nice motive here.
In addition to the various groups of works, 2 old televisions are piled on top of each other in the Soil Fictions exhibition. They show a 2-channel video installation that Angelika made during her studies in 2008.
On the top monitor, you can see a person who is not in the picture, but is filming how they walk through an urban area. And on the lower monitor, you can see a person who is not in the picture walking underground through a canal. And the work is called Parallel and was recorded and thematized in her home community of Feldbach in Styria. We all know what our city, our living space looks like above ground, but basically nobody has any idea what systems, what networks, what infrastructures exist underneath. And the physical distance is often only a few meters. And this discrepancy in our knowledge of these different worlds, or how they exist above and below ground, is something that is also central to this video work. So I found it exciting to weave it in here. And you can see how far back Angelika Loderer's interest in soil goes in her artistic work and forms a kind of root.
Soil Fictions can be seen at Belvedere 21 until the 15th of September, a personal exhibition by the artist Angelika Loderer, who subtly advocates a new self-image of man in his dealings with nature.
It was also very important to us that we didn't place any restrictions or floor markings here. It's also about taking a step back a bit and having respect for the fact that I don't have the right to be everywhere. And that, of course, is again in this discourse, this post-humanism, the question. I'm no longer at the center as a human being. I'm simply one of many actors, and that's something that I think is told here in a very poetic way.
Hier auf sehr fast schon poetische Weise eigentlich erzählt wird.
You've been listening to
Wer rettet die Welt? Der Ö1 Festival Podcast zur Klima Biennale Wien.
created by Till Couple and spoken by Julie McCarthy, Rosie Waits and Chris Cummins.